Let's break down three running backs, three wide receivers, a quarterback, and tight end who are absolute must start players heading into week 13 of the fantasy season. These players have way too good of matchups. They have way too much of upside, and ultimately, we cannot leave them on our bench because they are going to go absolutely nuclear here in week 13. All right, let's kick the video off with Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming off of a monster game, his best season so far on the year. 27.1 fantasy points, 87 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and added 6 receptions off of 6 targets for 64 receiving yards. A monster day, his first fantasy stat line that went over 20 fantasy points, but Bucky Irving has been great on the season with double digits in every game except for 2 since week 3 of the season. He sits as the RB24 right now in fantasy football and averaging 13 fantasy points per game. And now going into week 13, gets the Carolina Panthers, the team allowing the most fantasy points to the running back position on the entire season. This is a smash start. You absolutely cannot leave Bucky Irving on your bench. And for a lot of you guys, Irving is like your RB3. I mean, I know we've had a lot of injuries this season, but this was a player that you got off of the waiver wire. So you might even be in a position where you're flexing Bucky Irving, but whatever it is, he absolutely has to be in your starting lineup in week 13. I think overall this will be a big offensive day for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I still like Rachaad White in this matchup, Baker Mayfield, Kate Otten, Mike Evans. I think all these guys are set for good fantasy days, but I think the heartbeat of the offensive game plan here in week 13 is going to be run the football with Bucky Irving. He's due for another 20-plus fantasy type day. So whatever you do, leave Bucky Irving in your starting lineup in week 13. You know what? Let's stick with that same matchup, and let's take a look at Chuba Hubbard, who is coming in as your RB10 on the season. And I had some concerns about Chuba going into week 12 in a tough matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. Was not concerned about, Jonathan Brooks taking any touches, but it just didn't matter. I mean, Chuba, 16 total touches on the ground, 58 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, and had 5 targets, but just 1 catch for 2 receiving yards, but still got you 15 fantasy points. He now has double digits in every game on the season except for 2. He's still the clear-cut running back in this Carolina Panthers offense, no doubt about it. I'm still not worried about Jonathan Brooks taking away enough volume to where Chuba Hubbard is like not startable or anything. And this is a smash matchup this week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, allowing the 25th most fantasy points to the running back position. I know their defense played well last week, but that was because Tommy DeVito was a starting quarterback and the Giants could not move the football. So that's why we got nothing out of Tyrone Tracy. Plus, Tracy had his own fumbling issues, right? Chuba's going to be just fine this week. If he can get 15 fantasy points against the Kansas City Chiefs, I am not worried about him whatsoever against this Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. And on top of that, Bryce Young is playing some good football right now, so this Panthers team can move the football down the field. They're at home this week, so Chuba Hubbard is just a smash start this week. Super safe floor, but he has plenty of upside. Don't forget, he had 21 or more fantasy points in weeks 9 and 10 as well before Carolina had their bye week in week 11. Then, like I said, 15 fantasy points against one of the best run defenses in the NFL in week 12. Chuba Hubbard stays in our starting lineups, and I like this matchup overall as a matchup between the Bucs and the Panthers that could result in a lot of offense and a lot of total points, which is going to mean a lot of fantasy points for the respective offensive players in this matchup. So do not leave Chuba Hubbard on your bench in week 13. He is a must-start player. All right, last running back I'm going to mention is Kyren Williams of the LA Rams, a player who's been in a little bit of a slump lately. He's still your RB8 on the season. He still has only given you single digits once so far on the fantasy season, but in his last 4 games, 11.2 or less fantasy points. And by Kyren Williams standards, that's not very good. He also only has 1 touchdown since week 9 of the season. So we're used to seeing Kyren Williams get a touchdown like no matter what, right? I mean, you look through the first 8 weeks of the season, he had at least 1 touchdown in every game, right? So we've been missing that touchdown upside for Kyren, but I think he's going to bounce back this week. It's a great matchup. The Saints, one of the worst run defenses in the NFL. They've been getting absolutely shredded by running backs all season long, giving up the 26th most fantasy points to the running back position. This is a great bounce back spot for Kyron Williams. I know the Rams are on the road here, but I'm not too concerned about it. On top of that, this Saints defense is not very good against the pass either. So we know the Rams are going to be able to move the football with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. I think Matthew Stafford could have a nice day as well. But I think in the red zone, Kyron Williams is going to get plenty of opportunities. So if you own him and you're looking at the past couple weeks, there's a lot of crucial fantasy matchups right now as we're just around the corner from the fantasy playoffs. But I really think that Kyron Williams needs to stay in starting lineups this week. I had concerns about him last week against Philadelphia, and he was still pretty, in the past 3 games at least, he's been pretty efficient, 4.1 yards per carry or more. He's got it done on the ground. He just hasn't got it in the end zone, right? So, outside of week 12 where he did score that touchdown against Philly. But ultimately, I think this is a great bounce back spot for Kyron Williams. The matchup's too good to ignore. He gets another good matchup in week 14 against Buffalo, plus the Rams looking for a playoff spot. They're going to be trying to win these football games, doing everything they can to win these football games, playing through garbage time if they need to. So at the end of the day, I like Kyron a lot. Don't be too concerned about the past couple weeks. I know we only have 1 touchdown since week 8, but Kyron Williams, a strong start here in week 13. All right, next up is Courtland Sutton, moving along to wide receivers. He made the list last week, and he had 29.7 fantasy points against the Raiders, and I'm keeping him in this week. 10 targets, 8 catches, 97 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns for Sutton. He's averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game. He has moved up to the wide receiver 7 on the season, and he gets a smash matchup this week against the Cleveland Browns. We know this Broncos offense is rolling right now. Bo Nix looks fantastic. Things are opening up. Devon Vele's getting involved. They're finding ways to get it done with this wide receiver room, but the heartbeat and the clear number 1 wide receiver on this team is Courtland Sutton. He has had a double-digit performance in every game except for 2 since week 3 of the season, has only given you single digits 4 times on the entire season. Moving forward, Courtland Sutton's going to be a must-start player each and every week. And at this point, I think he's already in that category, right? So if you own him, absolutely do not bench him. The Browns are giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. This is a prime time game. This is a smash spot for Courtland Sutton. Do not leave him on your bench going into week 13. I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Courtland Sutton's receiving yards. I think this is a steal, sitting at 64.5 receiving yards. He has smashed that in every matchup since week 8. So make sure you head straight to Underdog before this line potentially changes to take Sutton's over on receiving yards, sitting at 64.5 receiving yards. And if you don't know, all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 13's action. All you need to do is take your free Pick'em, take the over on Sutton's receiving yards, and once both of these lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up with promo code DCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, let's move along to Marvin Harrison Jr., who's been very difficult to trust over the past couple weeks. Let's just look at the last 4 weeks. We have 23.1 points in a tough matchup, 3.4 points in a tough matchup, 16.4 in a tough matchup, then 7.7 this past week in a decent matchup. So he's been all over the place and has come through in some tough matchups against Miami and the Jets, right? But this week, he gets the best possible matchup you could ask for, as the Vikings are giving up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. He's still averaging double digits per game at 11.3 fantasy points per game. He's a wide receiver 18 on the season. I know it's been a bumpy road and maybe not exactly what you were expecting when you drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. We haven't gotten that consistency, but we haven't particularly gotten the consistency out of this entire offense this season. And I think this is a good game script for Marvin Harrison Jr. in a fantastic matchup. He almost had a touchdown in week 12, right? So I think he can easily bounce back and get you one of these double-digit performances in week 13. I know it's difficult to have confidence in Marvin Harrison Jr. right now from a fantasy perspective, but I would try to not overthink this one. I think he is a strong start this week in a very good matchup. Like I said, we should get a good game script this here, some offense in this game. Plus, Minnesota so good against the run that the Cardinals are going to be forced to throw the football throughout this game, which is going to mean targets for Marvin Harrison Jr. So if you own him, you're kind of wary about starting him this week. I would still start Marvin Harrison Jr. I think he's a very strong start, and I think he could be one of these players who really pops off this week with a lot of upside and an absolute smash matchup going into week 13. All right, last wide receiver I want to mention is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, coming off of a down game. Some weird antics in this game, but that's just George Pickens for you. And overall, the game script and the weather really did not benefit George Pickens, right? 7 targets, 4 catches, 48 receiving yards, 8.8 fantasy points. And we had really started to rely on Pickens as a viable option that you could trust on a weekly basis. In his previous 4 games, 11.4 or more fantasy points in every game with a ceiling of 22.1 fantasy points. But we looked to last week. The most encouraging thing was he was still the number 1 most targeted player on this entire team. So Pickens is still getting the volume, and this is a smash matchup as the Cincinnati Bengals secondary has been really bad the past couple of weeks, and they've moved back to giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So this is a good spot for Pickens. He's still going to see that volume, still going to get those targets, and this is one of those matchups where he should absolutely shine and get back to that double-digit type area. I think the snow game, just not a good place for George Pickens. So if you're looking at what happened last week, you're kind of thinking twice about things. Don't do it. Pickens could literally go nuclear this week, get you 20-plus fantasy points like we saw in week 7 and 10 as of late. So if you own Pickens, no reason to overthink this one. I know we got no teams on bye week, so you probably have a lot of options this week. Make sure George Pickens is in your lineup and that you're not benching him going into week 13. I'm going to give you guys one quarterback and one tight end, and let's look at Baker Moneymaker Mayfield, who is your quarterback 5 on the season, and I still get a lot of questions about Baker Mayfield. I don't know what else he needs to do on the season to just be a solidified starter in your roster. He has 18 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 on the season. He has over 20 fantasy points in every game on the season except for 5. He's been phenomenal this year, and he gets a smash matchup this week against the Carolina Panthers, giving up the 26 most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. They're weak against the run. They're not great against wide receivers. They're awful against tight ends, which we'll talk about in a second here. But ultimately, I think Baker, like 18.6 points, was a little bit disappointing to some fantasy managers in week 12. Didn't throw any touchdowns, did run for 1 touchdown, right? Did the DeVito dance and everything. But listen, he didn't need to throw any touchdowns last week. He just didn't. The Giants weren't doing anything offensively, and we saw 3 touchdowns to 3 different running backs. So don't get me wrong. Maybe that happens again this week, but ultimately there's a very safe floor with Baker Mayfield this week. But I think we're going to see the Panthers keep this game far more competitive than the Giants did this past week, and that's going to result in Baker needing to throw more and potentially throw actual touchdowns this week. So Baker, don't leave him on your bench. No reason to think twice about this. Baker is an absolute must-start player this week. This is a team trying to get atop of their division, at worst trying to get a wild card spot and make a playoff run. They really only have one tough matchup left on the season. They get Carolina, Las Vegas, the Chargers, their toughest matchup, but Chargers defense also hasn't been that good as of late. Then they get Dallas and Carolina. Great rest of season schedule for Baker Mayfield. He's a must-start player in week 13. And he's a must-start player the rest of the fantasy season, in my opinion. Like I said, we are sticking with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We're going to take a look at Cade Otton coming off of a down game in Week 12, his worst game on the season since Week 2 of the season with just 4 fantasy points, 3 targets, 1 catch, 30 receiving yards against the Giants. And a couple things here. A, once again, the Buccaneers did not need to throw the football in week 12. B, the Giants have actually been really good against opposing tight ends from a fantasy perspective all season long. One of the best teams in the league against opposing tight ends. And that's basically what happened in week 12. I mean, I know Mike Evans is back, so some people are now looking at this like, Otten, only 3 targets, 1 catch. Evans is back. Like, is he really going to be that fantasy option that he was the past couple weeks? He's still the pass catcher 2 on this team. Maybe you could argue the pass catcher 3 if we're looking at Bucky Irving or Rashad White in front of him. But the Panthers giving up the most fantasy points to the tight end position. They just gave up a double-digit game to both Travis Kelce and Noah Gray in the same matchup. They just cannot guard the tight end position. So I'm expecting a big week out of Cade Otton. I think he's a must-start player, a player that you can flex at the tight end position. He's up there like with a Jonnu Smith that you could throw into the flex and still expect a high amount of points out of. And he gets another smash matchup in week 14 against the Raiders. And don't forget, like I just said, he plays the Panthers again in the fantasy championship. So don't drop Cade Otton just because of this past week. Hold on to him. He was not necessary against the Giants. They did not need to throw the football, right? The game was not competitive at all, right? And the running backs did all the dirty work. So if you own Cade Otton, don't overreact to last week. It's a smash matchup this week. It'll be a more competitive game script. Ultimately, I'm calling him a must-start tight end going into week 13 of the season. That'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start players headed into week 13 of the fantasy season. Make sure those players are not on your bench because they could go absolutely nuclear this week. And as always, guys, don't forget I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. On top of that, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content, because every single week we're going to have everything that you could need to absolutely dominate 2024 fantasy football. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, saw it here on The Catch.